My name is Sarah Jane Vansworth. I am 29 years old, and I work as a senior risk auditor for a Tier 1 investment bank in the heart of the financial district. My entire professional existence is dedicated to the cold, hard science of identifying hidden liabilities and calculating the cost of failure before it happens. I spend 40 hours a week, and often 40 more, dissecting the financial entrails of corporations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, looking for the cracks in the foundation that everyone else ignores. It is a job that requires a lack of sentimentality and an obsession with objective truth. However, as I stood in my parents' kitchen in Greenwich, Connecticut, watching my father's face turn a shade of mottled crimson that matched his vintage Bordeaux, I realized that I had overlooked the most significant liability in my own life. It wasn't a bad debt or a fraudulent ledger. It was the two people who had raised me. If you cannot respect your sister's $14,000 vacation schedule, do not expect us to witness your little contract signing. My father spat, his voice vibrating with a level of venom usually reserved for people who defaulted on high-interest loans. He punctuated the sentence by slamming his midnight black $1,200 iPhone 15 Pro onto the polished absolute black granite countertop with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. The screen didn't shatter, but the violence of the movement caused his heavy 18-karat gold wedding band to chime against the stone. He refused to call it a wedding. To him, my marriage to a man he deemed beneath our tax bracket was nothing more than a legal transaction, a contract signing that was beneath the dignity of the Vansworth name. The air in the kitchen smelled of expensive Meyer lemon dish soap and the lingering scent of the $400 catering tray they had ordered for a lunch I was barely invited to. My mother, Evelyn, sat at the breakfast nook, her fingers tracing the rim of a bone china teacup that cost more than my first month of rent in the city. She didn't look up. She never looked up when my father, Harrison, was in one of his moods. She simply adjusted her cashmere wrap, a soft beige piece from Loro Piana that retailed for nearly $3,000, and sighed as if my presence were a smudge on a window she didn't have the energy to clean. The conflict was simple, yet absurd in its cruelty. My sister Chloe, who is 31 and has never held a job that didn't involve social media influence or daddy's credit card, had decided to book a luxury retreat to the Maldives. The cost of her 2-week stay at the Soneva Jani Resort, including the private villa with a retractable roof and round-the-clock butler service, was exactly $14,482. She had booked it for the 3rd week of September. That was the same week I was scheduled to marry Marcus, a man who worked 48-hour shifts as a surgical resident at Yale New Haven Hospital. We had chosen that date 14 months ago because it was the only window of time his residency program would allow him to take 4 consecutive days off. But to my father, Chloe's relaxation was a sacred event, while my life's milestones were inconveniences. Chloe had claimed that she was burnt out from the stress of rebranding her lifestyle blog, and therefore the family could not possibly attend my wedding because they needed to fly out to Mail to see her off and ensure she settled into her overwater bungalow. The sheer logistical insanity of choosing a vacation over a daughter's wedding was a calculation I couldn't make sense of, no matter how many risk models I ran in my head. I stood there, my hands clenched at my sides, wearing my charcoal gray tailored suit from Theory, a uniform of the world I had built for myself far away from the gilded cage of Greenwich. I looked at the kitchen clock, a handcrafted Swiss piece integrated into the cabinetry, ticking away the seconds of a life I was beginning to realize I no longer wanted to share with them. My father stood 6 feet tall, still imposing in his custom-tailored navy blazer and crisp white shirt. He looked at me, not with the love of a parent, but with the cold assessment of a CEO looking at a failing subsidiary. "You have always been difficult, Sarah Jane," my mother finally said, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the tension in the room. Her skin was flawlessly smooth, the result of monthly $1,200 laser treatments at a boutique clinic on the Upper East Side. She looked at me with those pale blue eyes, the same ones I see in the mirror every morning, but hers were devoid of any warmth. "Chloe needs this trip. She has had a very difficult year with the breakup and the issues with her followers. Your little ceremony at that public park or whatever it is can surely be moved. It is just a piece of paper, after all. If you loved this family, you would understand that we cannot be in two places at once, and Chloe was first to put her dates on the calendar." I felt a coldness settle into my marrow, a crystalline clarity that only comes when the last thread of hope finally snaps. I thought back to every childhood birthday where Chloe's gifts were larger, every graduation where my honors were overshadowed by her latest drama, and every moment I had tried to earn a seat at a table that was never built for me. I looked at the granite, at the expensive phone, at the designer clothes, and I saw them for what they were. They were just assets, and I was an expense they were no longer willing to cover. My father picked up his phone, the screen lighting up with a notification from his private wealth manager. He didn't even wait for me to respond. He began scrolling, his thumb moving with a practiced indifference. He was already done with the conversation. He had delivered his ultimatum, and in his world people either complied or they ceased to exist. He expected me to cry, to beg, to offer to move the wedding to a Tuesday in November just so they could grace us with their presence for 20 minutes before heading to their country club. But I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. I thought about Marcus, who grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Scranton with 4 siblings, a man whose mother worked 2 jobs as a grocery store clerk just to buy him his first stethoscope. I thought about the way he looked at me, not as a Vanceworth, but as Sarah Jane, the woman who liked her coffee too strong and her books too heavy. He was the only person who had ever made me feel like I wasn't a liability to be managed. I reached into my leather tote bag, the one I had bought with my first year-end bonus, and pulled out my keys to my 2024 Glacier White Audi A4. It was a modest car by Greenwich standards, but it was mine. It wasn't a gift, it wasn't a bribe, and it didn't come with strings attached. I looked at my father, who was now typing an email, likely regarding a real estate acquisition in the Hamptons. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice steady, echoing off the high ceilings and the custom crown molding. "It is just a contract, and as an auditor, I have spent a lot of time reviewing contracts that are no longer beneficial to the parties involved. Usually, when one side fails to meet their obligations, the most logical step is to terminate the agreement immediately to prevent further loss." He stopped typing. He looked up, his brows knitting together in confusion. He wasn't used to me using my professional vocabulary at home. To him, I was just the quiet daughter who did the math and didn't cause trouble. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, a warning sign I had feared since I was 5 years old. "I am talking about the liability of this relationship," I replied, stepping back toward the door that led to the 4-car garage where his $85,000 Porsche Macan and my mother's $110,000 Range Rover sat gleaming under industrial LED lights. "If my wedding is a contract signing, then consider this my official notice of withdrawal. You don't have to worry about the vacation schedule, and you don't have to worry about the wedding. In fact, you don't have to worry about me at all." I turned and walked out, the sound of my heels clicking on the marble entryway. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name, not with affection, but with a sharp, irritated tone, as if I had just spilled red wine on her cream-colored rug. I didn't stop. I walked through the garage, the air thick with the smell of expensive tires and car wax. I got into my Audi, the engine turning over with a smooth, mechanical hum that felt like the first breath of fresh air I had taken in decades. As I backed out of the long, winding driveway, past the meticulously manicured boxwood hedges and the security gate that kept the rest of the world away from the Vansworths, I felt a strange sense of weightlessness. For 29 years, I had tried to calculate the value of their love, trying to find a way to make the numbers balance. I had tried to be the perfect daughter, the successful professional, the quiet sister who never asked for more than her share. But sitting in that car, heading toward the Merritt Parkway and away from the life I had known, I realized that some debts can never be repaid, and some relationships are simply bankrupt. I drove toward the city, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long, golden shadows across the asphalt. My phone buzzed in the center console. It was a text from Chloe. It was a photo of a silk bikini she had just bought for $1,800, followed by a message asking if I thought the color would pop against the turquoise water of the Maldives. She didn't even mention the wedding. She didn't even know the bridge had been burned. I didn't reply. I deleted the thread. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard, 6:42 p.m., and I realized that for the first time in my life, my time was entirely my own. I wasn't a Vansworth anymore. I was Sarah Jane, and I was finally starting to audit the only life that actually mattered. I knew the fallout would be catastrophic. My father was not a man who took rejection lightly. He would see my defiance as a personal insult, a breach of the family brand. He would likely call my office, try to speak to my managing director, or find some way to exert the financial pressure he had used as a leash my entire life. But what he didn't realize was that I had already accounted for that. I had my own savings, my own reputation, and a man waiting for me in a small apartment in New Haven who loved me more than any trust fund ever could. The drive was quiet, the hum of the tires on the highway providing a rhythmic soundtrack to my thoughts. I thought about the wedding, now only 6 weeks away. We wouldn't have the grand ballroom at the Pierre, and there wouldn't be a 5-tier cake from a celebrity baker. There would be a small gathering in a park overlooking the water, a dinner at a local Italian bistro where the owner knew Marcus by his first name, and a guest list of people who actually wanted to be there. It wouldn't be a Vansworth event, and that was the most beautiful thing about it. As I pulled into my own driveway, a modest space in a neighborhood where people actually knew their neighbors, I saw the lights on in the kitchen window. I knew Marcus was inside, probably heating up leftovers after a 12-hour shift, unaware that the world we knew had just shifted on its axis. I sat in the car for a moment, the engine cooling, the metal making small, ticking sounds as it contracted. I realized then that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you earn through loyalty, through showing up, and through respecting the life someone else is trying to build. My parents had failed every test of character I had ever put before them, and tonight I had finally stopped grading them on a curve. I was done being the daughter who was less important than a $14,000 vacation. I was done being a footnote in Chloe's social media feed. I was free. The financial gap within the Vansworth family was not merely a difference in bank balances. It was a yawning, jagged canyon that defined every interaction, every holiday, and every silent resentment I had carried since I was old enough to understand the value of a dollar. My sister Chloe was the undisputed golden child of the Vansworth dynasty, a title she wore with the effortless, unthinking grace of someone who had never once looked at the price tag on a menu or worried about a late fee on a utility bill. At 32 years old, Chloe had managed to exist for 4 consecutive years without working a single day, her entire lifestyle subsidized by the invisible, bottomless hand of the Vansworth Family Trust, a legal entity that seemed to exist solely to shield her from the consequences of her own inertia. She lived in a sprawling $3,500 a month apartment in the heart of Lincoln Park, where the floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the lush greenery of the park and the distant, shimmering blue of Lake Michigan, a view that was bought and paid for by my father's quarterly dividends. To celebrate her 30th birthday, a milestone she reached with no more effort than simply continuing to breathe, my parents had gifted her a brand-new Carrara white Porsche Macan with a garnet red leather interior, a vehicle that cost more than the annual salary of the teachers who had once tried to help me navigate my early academic struggles. While Chloe was navigating the streets of Chicago in her luxury German SUV, I was drowning in the gritty, unglamorous reality of a life built from scratch, spending 70 hours a week inside the windowless audit rooms of downtown firms, my eyes burning from the blue light of spreadsheets and the relentless pressure of Tier 1 investment banking. I didn't have a trust fund or a safety net. I had a mountain of student loans and a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of expensive coffee could cure. I had saved every penny, skipped every non-essential meal, and sacrificed my entire social life to finally purchase a modest 840-square-foot fixer-upper in a neighborhood that was safe but decidedly unchic. It was a house that smelled faintly of old plaster and ambition, a place where the floorboards creaked under my feet and the kitchen cabinets were painted a shade of yellow that had gone out of style in the 1970s. But it was mine, earned through the sweat of my brow and the meticulous auditing of high-risk assets, a feat of financial independence that my parents viewed not with pride, but with a patronizing sort of pity, as if my hard work were a hobby they didn't quite understand. The contrast between our lives reached a boiling point during my own engagement party, an event I had meticulously planned on a budget that required me to account for every single appetizer and bottle of mid-tier Prosecco. I remember standing in the small, rented community hall, feeling the weight of the moment and the love of the few friends who truly knew me, while wearing a pair of $45 heels I had found on the clearance rack at DSW. They were black, sensible, and pinched my toes slightly at the edges, a stark reminder of the financial boundaries I lived within. Marcus stood beside me, looking handsome in a suit he had owned since medical school graduation, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel like I had succeeded. That feeling evaporated the second Chloe swept into the room, her presence announced by the sharp, authoritative click of $1,200 Jimmy Choo Bing pumps against the linoleum floor. She was draped in a silk slip dress that cost more than my mortgage payment, and she didn't even say hello before she began a whispered, yet perfectly audible critique of the evening. She stood near the buffet table, holding a glass of the sparkling wine I had carefully selected, her nose wrinkled in a display of performative disgust as she complained to our mother that the $60 per plate catering wasn't organic enough for her current dietary requirements. She spoke about the lack of farm-to-table sourcing as if my engagement party were a personal affront to her digestive system, while our mother, Linda, nodded sympathetically, adjusting her own heavy gold bracelets and promising to take Chloe out for a proper meal at a Michelin-starred French bistro the following afternoon to make up for the hardship. They didn't see the irony of a woman who didn't work complaining about the quality of a meal paid for by the person who worked 80 hours a week. To them, Chloe's comfort was a fundamental right, while my efforts were merely the expected performance of a second-tier daughter. My father, Harrison, stood in the corner checking his watch, his posture radiating a quiet impatience that suggested he would rather be anywhere else than celebrating a union that didn't involve a merger of two prominent family names. In the Vansworth household, money was the language of love, and the fluency with which it was spoken was reserved entirely for Chloe. When she decided she wanted to pursue a career as a wellness influencer, my father didn't ask for a business plan or a projected return on investment. He simply cut a check for $20,000 to cover her initial branding, equipment, and a high-end photography team. When she grew bored of that and decided she needed to clear her head, the family trust opened up to fund a 6-month trek through Europe, staying in boutique hotels where the nightly rate was higher than my weekly paycheck. Every time she stumbled, there was a velvet cushion waiting to catch her, a net woven from the dividends of companies I spent my days auditing for fraud and mismanagement. I saw the numbers behind the lifestyle. I knew the exact mechanics of how that wealth was generated and protected, and it made the injustice of its distribution feel like a physical weight in my chest. I remember one specific evening, shortly after I had closed on my small house, when I invited them over for a celebratory dinner. I had spent 3 days cleaning, scrubbing the baseboards by hand and polishing the old brass fixtures until they gleamed, hoping that for once they would see the value in what I had accomplished. I had prepared a beef bourguignon, slow-cooked for 8 hours until the meat was tender, using ingredients that had pushed my weekly grocery budget to its absolute limit. When they arrived, Chloe didn't even take her coat off, a $1,000 trench coat she tossed onto my vintage thrift store sofa with an air of casual dismissal. She walked through my 840 square feet as if she were inspecting a prison cell, her eyes lingering on the slightly uneven tile in the bathroom and the small patch of lawn in the back that I hadn't yet had the time to reseed. My mother followed her, her mouth set in a tight, thin line of polite disapproval, finally commenting that the space was very cozy, a word that in Vansworth speak was a devastating synonym for cramped and pathetic. My father spent the entire dinner talking about a new commercial development he was financing in Stamford, ignoring my attempts to discuss my recent promotion to senior risk auditor or the fact that I had just successfully uncovered a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme at one of the city's largest logistics firms. He wasn't interested in my professional triumphs because they weren't triumphs he had facilitated. He only cared about the successes he could claim credit for, and since I had insisted on paying my own way since the day I turned 21, I was a ledger he couldn't balance in his favor. Chloe, meanwhile, interrupted my father to complain that the air conditioning in her Lincoln Park apartment was making a slight humming sound that disturbed her meditation, and within seconds, my mother was on her phone, calling the building manager and demanding that a technician be sent up immediately, regardless of the hour or the cost. The realization that I was an outsider in my own family wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a slow, agonizing accumulation of moments like these, where the discrepancy between Chloe's effortless luxury and my hard-won stability was weaponized against me. They viewed my independence as a form of rebellion, a stubborn refusal to play the role of the grateful, submissive daughter who would beg for their approval. Because I didn't need their money, they felt I didn't need their respect. And because I didn't ask for their help, they assumed I didn't deserve their presence. The $14,000 vacation Chloe had planned was just the latest entry in a long list of expenditures that were prioritized over my life. A final confirmation that in the Vansworth family audit, I was a line item they were more than happy to delete. I sat in my office the day after the confrontation in their kitchen, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as I stared at a complex risk model for a mid-sized tech acquisition. The numbers on the screen were cold and objective, representing the reality of a company's worth, and I realized that I needed to apply that same cold objectivity to my own life. I had been trying to find value in a relationship that had been insolvent for years, pouring my emotional capital into a family that offered zero return on my investment. Chloe would go to the Maldives, She would take photos of herself in her $1,800 bikini, and she would receive thousands of likes from strangers who didn't know that her entire existence was a beautiful, hollow shell. My parents would sit on their beach chairs, convinced they were doing the right thing by supporting their favored child, while I would be in a park in Connecticut, signing a marriage license with a man who knew exactly what I was worth because he had seen me build myself from nothing. The canyon between us was too wide to bridge, and for the first time, I was okay with that. I didn't want to cross over to their side anymore, where the air was thin and the people were made of glass. I wanted to stay on my side, where the floors creaked and the shoes were cheap, but the foundation was solid and the love was real. As I closed the audit file on my computer and prepared to head home to Marcus, I felt a sense of finality that was more satisfying than any financial windfall. I was done being the liability. I was done being the footnote, and I was done trying to justify my existence to people who only understood the language of trust funds and Jimmy Choo pumps. I was Sarah Jane Vansworth, and I was finally closing the books on the people who had never truly seen me. The betrayal did not arrive as a sudden explosion, but as a calculated, frigid realization that crystallized on July 14th at precisely 6:42 p.m., a moment etched into my memory with the surgical precision of a timestamp on a death certificate. I remember the exact quality of the light filtering through my office window in Manhattan, a dusty gold that illuminated the spreadsheets I had been ignoring while staring at my wedding planner. I had painstakingly secured the Heritage Vineyard for our ceremony, a venue renowned for its rolling hills and a 19th-century stone chapel that felt like a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. A choice that required a $12,500 non-refundable deposit that represented months of disciplined saving. It was the place where Marcus and I had envisioned beginning our lives together, a setting that felt worthy of the promises we were preparing to make. But that dream was dismantled by a single, casual whim from my sister, Chloe. With the effortless entitlement that had characterized her entire 32 years of existence, Chloe decided she wanted to fly to Ibiza for a series of exclusive beach club openings that happened to fall during that exact week in September, a trip she described as a necessary soul-searching journey rather than the hedonistic vacation it actually was. My father did not call to negotiate or to offer a compromise. He called to deliver an ultimatum with the cold, detached efficiency of a corporate raider liquidating an unprofitable subsidiary. He stood in his mahogany-paneled study in Greenwich, likely swirling a glass of 25-year-old Macallan, and told me that if I did not move the wedding to November, he and my mother would not be in attendance. He spoke as if my life's most significant milestone were a flexible business meeting that could be rescheduled to accommodate his favorite daughter's social calendar, completely ignoring the fact that moving the date meant forfeiting my $12,500 deposit and the $4,000 floral retainer I had paid to a boutique designer in Hartford. He didn't care about the $16,500 that would vanish into thin air, money I had earned through 70-hour work weeks and meticulous auditing, because to him, my financial sacrifices were invisible and my autonomy was an insult. I refused to move the date, my voice trembling but certain as I told him that Marcus's hospital schedule was fixed and my dignity was not for sale, a declaration that was met with a silence so heavy I could feel the final threads of our familial bond fraying and snapping across the telephone line. The morning of my wedding was a blur of hyper-realistic sensory details, from the scent of the expensive stargazer lilies that filled the stone chapel to the weight of my grandmother's vintage lace veil against my hair. By 4:30 p.m., the time the ceremony was scheduled to begin, the air inside the chapel was thick with the expectant hum of 185 guests, colleagues from the bank, Marcus's fellow residents, and friends who had watched me navigate the minefield of my family for years. I stood in the small anteroom, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, clutching a bouquet of white roses so tightly the stems left indentations in my palms. My bridesmaid, a woman I had audited countless ledgers with, looked at me with a mixture of pity and admiration, and I knew without her saying a word that the front row was still a void of unfulfilled expectations. When the heavy oak doors finally swung open and the first notes of the string quartet echoed through the rafters, I began the long, solitary walk down the aisle, a path that felt miles long under the collective gaze of nearly 200 people. The chapel was a masterpiece of architectural elegance, the afternoon sun streaming through stained glass windows to cast fractured patterns of ruby and sapphire across the stone floor. But my eyes were fixed on only one thing. In the very front row, 2 hand-carved mahogany chairs sat empty, their velvet cushions undisturbed, representing a silence more deafening than any shouting match we had ever had. Those empty seats were a public declaration of my parents' priorities, a visual confirmation that a beach club in Spain and a $14,000 vacation for Chloe were worth more to them than the sight of their second daughter taking her marriage vows. I could hear the rhythmic whispering of the guests, a low tide of speculation that ebbed and flowed through the pews as they realized the Vansworth patriarch and matriarch had chosen to be absent from their own daughter's union. The smell of the lilies which I had chosen for their purity and grace suddenly felt cloying and funereal, mixing with the sharp, metallic salt of my own tears as they escaped my composure and tracked down my cheeks. I wasn't crying because I missed them. I was crying because the last shred of my denial had finally been stripped away, leaving me to face the naked truth that I had been an orphan in a house full of people my entire life. Every step toward the altar was a step away from the Vansworth legacy of conditional love, and toward a future where I would never again have to audit my own worth to see if it met someone else's minimum requirements. Marcus stood at the end of the aisle, his face a portrait of fierce, unwavering support, his eyes locked onto mine as if he were trying to pull me toward him through sheer force of will. He knew the cost of those empty chairs. He knew the weight of the $16,000 I had been told to throw away. And he knew that in this moment, I was finally choosing myself over the toxic ledger of my childhood. As I reached his side and felt his hand close around mine, his skin warm and steady against my cold fingers, the whispers of the crowd seemed to recede into the background, replaced by a profound, echoing clarity. I stood there in my white dress, a woman who had built a career on identifying risks and managing liabilities, and I realized that I had finally successfully mitigated the greatest risk of my life. By refusing to comply with my father's ultimatum, I had lost a deposit, but I had gained a soul. I had lost a front row of parents, but I had gained a life of authenticity. The ceremony proceeded with a weightiness that felt grounded in reality rather than performance, the words of the officiant ringing through the chapel like a bell in a storm. We exchanged rings, small circles of platinum that represented a commitment that wasn't dependent on luxury vacations or family trusts, and for the first time in 29 years, I felt like the balance sheet of my life finally made sense. Behind me, the empty mahogany chairs remained as a monument to their betrayal. But in front of me was a man who had worked double shifts so we could afford the down payment on our fixer-upper, a man who didn't care about my sister's Porsche or my father's influence. I thought about them in Ibiza, perhaps sitting at a white-clothed table overlooking the Mediterranean, toasting to Chloe's latest whim, while their youngest daughter stood in a chapel in Connecticut, redefining what it meant to be a family. They would probably tell their friends that they couldn't make it due to a scheduling conflict, a polite euphemism for their own cruelty. But the 185 people in this room knew the truth. The truth was that Harrison and Linda Vansworth were fundamentally bankrupt in the only currency that actually mattered, and they had defaulted on their most basic obligation as parents. The reception that followed was not the gilded, stiff affair my parents would have demanded, but a vibrant, joyous celebration fueled by the relief of being free from their shadow. We danced on the vineyard's patio under a canopy of fairy lights, the air cooling as the sun dipped below the horizon, and I realized that the silence of those empty chairs had been replaced by the laughter of people who actually chose to be there. I watched Marcus talking to my colleagues, his laughter genuine and unforced, and I felt a sense of peace that no amount of Vansworth money could ever buy. The betrayal was complete, the bridge was burned, and as I looked out over the darkened vines of the Heritage Vineyard, I knew that I would never look back. I had survived the audit of my own family, and while the losses were significant, the assets I had left, my husband, my career, and my self-respect, were more than enough to build an empire of my own. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins or the name on your birth certificate. Family is the people who show up when the seats are empty and the tears are falling, the ones who stand by you when the world tells you that you aren't worth the price of a plane ticket. I was Sarah Jane. I was a wife. I was a survivor. And for the first time in my life, I was no longer a Vansworth liability. At precisely 2:14 a.m. on the night of my wedding, while the world outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of our hotel suite was a silent tapestry of city lights and drifting shadows, I found myself sitting at the sleek, glass-topped desk with my MacBook Pro open and humming with a quiet, clinical energy. My new husband, Marcus, lay asleep in the oversized king bed behind me, his breathing rhythmic and deep, a stark contrast to the electric, cold focus that had taken hold of my mind. The moonlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the suite, illuminating the ivory lace of my wedding dress, which was draped carefully over a chair. But I didn't look at it. I didn't feel the post-wedding glow or the lingering warmth of our first dance. Instead, I felt a familiar, sharp clarity that usually only arrived when I was deep into a forensic audit for the bank, a sensation of the pieces of a puzzle finally beginning to align in a way that spelled disaster for someone else. I did not cry for the empty chairs in the chapel or for the parents who were at that very moment likely sipping overpriced cocktails in an Ibiza lounge while celebrating my sister's whims. I was done with tears because tears are a reaction to a loss you cannot quantify. And as a senior risk auditor, I was finally ready to quantify the exact cost of the Vansworth family's betrayal. I opened a double-encrypted Excel file that I had been building in the margins of my life for months, a digital ledger of suspicions that I had never before had the cold-blooded resolve to finalize. Leveraging the high-level access I maintained to premium financial databases and the public filings of my father's logistics empire, Vansworth Global, I began the grueling process of cross-referencing every public transaction with the private disbursements of the Vansworth Family Trust. For 4 hours, the only sound in the room was the soft, rapid-fire clicking of my mechanical keyboard and the occasional hum of the mini-fridge in the corner of the room. I navigated through layers of corporate shielding, through subsidiaries and holding companies registered in tax-friendly jurisdictions, my eyes scanning line after line of alphanumeric code and transaction timestamps. I wasn't looking for proof of their favoritism toward Chloe anymore because that was a fact of my existence. I was looking for the structural integrity of the bridge they had used to bypass the law. The breakthrough came at 4:30 a.m., when I discovered a recurring pattern of wire transfers that made my blood run as cold as the air conditioning in the suite. I found 48 separate illegal wire transfers, totaling exactly $842,000, all flowing from the operational accounts of Vanceworth Global into a shell company named CVK Aesthetics. The name was a thinly veiled nod to my sister's full name, Chloe Victoria Vanceworth, and the company was registered to a small, nondescript P.O. box in Delaware. These transfers were meticulously labeled as consulting fees for market expansion and brand strategy, but as I dug deeper into the minority shareholder reports and the internal tax IDs, the truth became undeniable. There was no brand strategy, there was no market expansion, and there certainly was no consulting being done by a woman who spent her afternoons choosing between $1,800 bikinis and boutique yoga classes. This was a textbook case of embezzlement and systemic tax evasion, a way for my father to funnel corporate profits directly to his golden child while bypassing the legal oversight of the minority shareholders who had trusted him with their investments. As I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, I realized the magnitude of what I had uncovered in the silence of my wedding night. My father had been stealing from his own company to fund Chloe's $3,500 a month apartment, her white Porsche Macan, and her $14,000 luxury vacations. He had been cooking the books for years, treating a multi-million-dollar corporation like a personal piggy bank for the only daughter he actually valued, all while telling me that my wedding was a mere contract signing. The irony was a physical weight in the room. While they were off in Spain looking down on my simple ceremony, they were standing on a foundation of fraud that I, the daughter they had discarded, was now holding the blueprints to. I felt a grim professional satisfaction as I mapped out the flow of the $842,000, seeing the exact dates where the company's dividend payouts to honest investors had been suppressed to cover the very consulting fees that were actually paying for Chloe's Jimmy Choo pumps. I spent the next hour exporting the data into a secure cloud drive and creating a secondary backup on an encrypted physical key that I tucked into the hidden pocket of my laptop bag. I thought about the board of directors at Vanceworth Global, men and women who had known me since I was a child and who had always praised my father's integrity while ignoring the quiet, studious daughter in the background. I thought about the legal ramifications for a man who valued the Vanceworth name above all else, and how that name would look splashed across a federal indictment for tax fraud and fiduciary negligence. The liability I had sensed in my parents' kitchen weeks ago had finally been given a dollar amount, and it was a figure that would bankrupt them not just financially, but socially and legally. I wasn't just Sarah Jane the auditor anymore. I was the person holding the detonator to the gilded cage they had built for Chloe at the expense of everyone else's hard work. By 5:45 a.m., the first hints of dawn were beginning to bleed into the horizon, a pale gray light that made the hotel suite look sterile and sharp. I closed my MacBook Pro with a definitive snap that sounded like the closing of a coffin lid. I looked over at Marcus, who was still asleep, a man of genuine honor who would never dream of the kind of calculated greed I had just spent the night documenting. I knew that when he woke up, our life would be different, not just because we were married, but because I was about to set a fire that would consume the world I had come from. My name is Sarah Jane Vanceworth, and for 29 years, I was the one who followed the rules while my family broke them to ensure I never felt equal to my sister. But the thing about being an auditor is that you learn how to wait for the final tally, and you learn that the person who keeps the records is the one who truly holds the power. The $842,000 was more than just a sum of money. It was a record of every time they had looked at me and decided I wasn't worth the truth. It was the price of the empty chairs at my wedding, the cost of every birthday forgotten, and the bill for every time Chloe's luxury was prioritized over my basic dignity. I sat back in the chair, my body finally feeling the exhaustion of the day and the night, but my mind was incredibly peaceful. I had spent my career finding hidden liabilities in companies, and I had finally found the one that would bring down the House of Vansworth. They thought they had escaped to Ibiza to avoid the inconvenience of my wedding, but they had actually left the door wide open for me to audit the very soul of their empire. I was no longer interested in their approval or their presence in my life. I was only interested in the objective reality of the numbers, and the numbers said that they were finished. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the hotel room floor, I felt a sense of closure that no ceremony could have provided. I had a husband who loved me, a career I had built with my own hands, and a secret that was worth more than any inheritance I had ever been denied. I realized then that family isn't about blood or loyalty to a name. It's about the transparency of the heart and the integrity of your actions. My father and sister had traded their integrity for a shell company and a few years of unearned luxury, and now the bill was coming due. I would walk out of this hotel as a woman who had finally balanced her own books, leaving the debt of the Vansworth family behind me for the authorities and the shareholders to collect. I looked at the ivory dress one last time and smiled, not because of the lace or the fashion, but because it was the last thing I would ever wear as a member of a family that didn't deserve me. The audit was over, the findings were conclusive, and for the first time in my life, I was the one in control of the narrative. I would enjoy my honeymoon with Marcus. I would breathe in the fresh air of a life without their shadow, and when we returned, I would hand over the files that would ensure Chloe's next vacation was to a federal courtroom. I had calculated the risk, I had identified the liability, and I was ready to execute the final stage of the plan. My father had called my wedding a contract signing, and he was right. It was the contract that finally severed my ties to his corruption and guaranteed my own freedom. Monday morning arrived with a sharp, clinical coldness that matched the resolve hardening in my chest, and at exactly 9 a.m., I found myself standing before the frosted glass doors of Thorne and Associates in downtown New Haven. I wasn't there as the daughter who had been snubbed at her own wedding or the sister who had been sidelined for a $14,000 vacation. I was there as a senior risk auditor, executing the final phase of a high-stakes liquidation. I met with Marcus Thorne, a high-stakes litigation attorney whose reputation for dismantling corporate giants was as formidable as his physical presence. His private office was a sanctuary of old-world power, smelling heavily of $80 an ounce pipe tobacco, polished mahogany, and the scent of well-worn leather-bound books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The air was thick with the quiet, expensive hum of a high-end air purification system, but it couldn't mask the gravity of the documents I was about to lay on his desk. Thorne himself was a man who moved with the deliberate, predatory grace of someone who had never lost a fight he couldn't bill for, and he watched me with sharp, intelligent eyes as I sat across from him in a chair that likely cost more than my first car. I did not offer small talk or pleasantries about the weather. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder that contained the cumulative evidence of my family's moral and legal bankruptcy. I handed him 114 pages of meticulously annotated bank statements, 14 notarized affidavits from minority shareholders I had quietly contacted over the weekend, and a secure USB drive encased in a brushed aluminum housing. On that drive was the crowning achievement of my investigation: 4K dashcam footage from my 2024 Audi A4, which I had strategically parked near a secluded corner of the Greenwich Harbor parking lot 3 weeks prior. The footage clearly showed my father, Harrison Vanceworth, leaning against his $85,000 Porsche Macan, handing a thick envelope to a man the company ledgers referred to as a senior logistics consultant. In reality, the high-definition zoom revealed the face of Julian Vane, a 24-year-old aspiring model and professional loafer who also happened to be Chloe's boyfriend. There was no consulting happening in that parking lot. There was only the physical transfer of corporate assets into the hands of a shell company designed to fund my sister's extravagant lifestyle. Thorne took the folder from my hands, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper with a practiced, almost reverent touch as he began to scan the first few pages of my audit. He leaned back in his $5,000 Herman Miller Eames lounge chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight, and for several minutes, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic turning of pages and the ticking of a gold Patek Philippe clock on his mantel. I watched his expression shift from professional curiosity to the grim, focused intensity of a hunter who had just stumbled upon the fresh tracks of a large and dangerous animal. He stopped at page 42, where I had mapped out the exact flow of the $842,000 from Vanceworth Global into Chloe's Delaware-based shell company, CVK Aesthetics. He looked at the screenshots of the wire transfers, the forged signatures on the consulting agreements, and the tax IDs that led directly back to my father's private office in Greenwich. "This isn't just a family feud, Sarah Jane," Thorne finally said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant register that echoed off the wood-paneled walls and made the hair on my arms stand up. He set the folder down on his desk, his eyes locking onto mine with a look of profound clinical assessment. "This is a federal felony, or rather a series of them, ranging from wire fraud and tax evasion to a blatant breach of fiduciary duty that would make a bankruptcy liquidator blush. You haven't just found a mistake in the books. You've uncovered a systemic criminal enterprise designed to defraud the government and the minority shareholders of Vanceworth Global for the sole purpose of maintaining your sister's standard of living." He paused, picking up a heavy silver pen and tapping it against the desk in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "If we move forward with this, if we file these documents with the SEC and the district attorney, there is no going back. Your father will lose the company, the house in Greenwich, and quite likely his freedom." I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the crushing weight of my father's expectations or the stinging resentment of Chloe's favoritism. I felt the cool, detached certainty of an auditor who had reached the end of a long and complicated reconciliation. I thought about the $14,000 they had prioritized over my wedding, the $1,200 phone my father had slammed on the counter while calling my marriage a contract, and the empty mahogany chairs in the front row of the chapel. I thought about the 70-hour work weeks I had endured while Chloe was gifted a Porsche for simply existing. The liability had been identified, the risk had been assessed, and the cost of doing nothing was now far higher than the cost of action. I leaned forward, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand as I gave him the only instruction that mattered. "I want you to prepare the final audit," I said, using the terminology we used at the bank for the absolute, irreversible closing of a fraudulent account. "I don't want a settlement, and I don't want a public apology. I want the objective truth to be made a matter of public record. I want the shareholders to see exactly where their dividends went, and I want the IRS to see exactly how my father and sister have been subsidizing their Ibiza vacations." Thorne nodded, a small, predatory smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he picked up his phone to summon his senior paralegals. He knew as well as I did that the evidence I had provided was ironclad. a perfect storm of financial documentation and physical proof that left no room for legal maneuvering or family influence. My father had always believed that his wealth made him untouchable, that he could buy his way out of any inconvenience and manipulate the narrative to suit his brand. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. He had raised a daughter who was better at his own game than he was. He had treated me like a secondary asset, a footnote in the Vansworth ledger, but in doing so, he had given me the perfect vantage point to observe the cracks in his foundation. I had spent my life being the quiet auditor in the corner, the one who saw everything and said nothing. But that morning, the silence was officially over. As I walked out of Thorne's office and back into the bright morning bustle of New Haven, I felt a strange sense of liberation that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. I walked toward my 2024 Audi A4, the sun glinting off the glacier-white paint, and I felt the weight of the Vansworth name finally falling away from me like a heavy, leaden cloak. I wasn't just Sarah Jane the daughter anymore. I was the primary witness for the prosecution, the woman who had audited the very soul of her family and found it wanting. I knew that within 48 hours, the first subpoenas would be served at the Vansworth Global Headquarters in Stamford, and the carefully constructed facade of my father's life would begin to crumble. He would call me. He would scream. He would threaten to disinherit me from a fortune that was already built on lies. But I wouldn't answer. I didn't need his money, and I certainly didn't need his approval. I drove back toward the small 840-square-foot house that Marcus and I were turning into a home, thinking about the contrast between the life I was building and the one I was about to dismantle. My kitchen had old cabinets and creaky floors, but every item in it was paid for with honest labor and genuine love. There were no shell companies in my basement and no illegal wire transfers in my bank account. I thought about Chloe, who was likely still in Ibiza, unaware that the white Porsche and the $3,500 apartment were about to be seized as part of a federal asset forfeiture. She had spent 32 years believing that the world owed her everything, never realizing that the bill was being tallied by the sister she had spent her life belittling. The gap between us was no longer a canyon of wealth. It was a chasm of character, and as of 9 a.m. this morning, that chasm had become a fortress that would keep them out of my life forever. The final audit was more than a legal filing. It was my declaration of independence. It was the moment I stopped trying to balance the scales of my parents' affection and started weighing their actions against the law. I had spent 29 years being the liability, but as I pulled into my driveway and saw Marcus waving from the porch, I realized that I was actually the greatest asset I had ever known. I had the intelligence to see the truth, the courage to document it, and the strength to hold the people I once loved accountable for their choices. The Vansworth family legacy was about to end in a flurry of legal briefs and forensic accounting reports, and I was the one who had written the final chapter. As I stepped out of the car and felt the warm Connecticut air on my face, I knew that for the first time in my life, the books were finally, beautifully, and permanently balanced. Family isn't about protecting the secrets of the corrupt or enabling the greed of the favored. It's about the integrity to stand for what is right, even when it means standing alone against the people who gave you your name. I was Sarah Jane, I was an auditor, and I was finally free of the debt of being a Vansworth. 6 weeks had passed since the night of my wedding, 42 days of calculated silence and surgical preparation that felt like the quiet before a tectonic shift. It was a Saturday evening, and the Vansworth estate in Greenwich was bathed in the kind of golden, artificial glow that only immense, unearned wealth can provide. My parents were throwing a welcome-back gala for Chloe, a celebration of her return from the Maldives and Ibiza, a victory lap for a woman whose only achievement was successfully spending $85,000 of other people's money in a single summer. The guest list was a curated directory of Connecticut's elite, 65 people who represented the social and financial backbone of my father's world, all gathered on the meticulously manicured West Lawn. They were sipping Moet and Chandon from crystal flutes that caught the light of the low-hanging chandeliers and eating $150 per pound Wagyu beef sliders served on silver platters by a staff that moved like shadows. At exactly 8:45 p.m., the sky had settled into a clear, deep navy blue, and the air was a perfect, crisp 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of evening that seemed designed to mask the rot beneath the surface of the Vansworth legacy. I arrived not as a guest, but as a reckoning, stepping out of my glacier-white Audi and onto the crushed gravel driveway with a sense of purpose that felt heavier than the car itself. I was wearing a black, $2,400 Alexander McQueen power suit, the sharp tailoring of the shoulders and the clinical lines of the blazer serving as my armor for the execution of the final audit. I didn't carry a gift wrapped in expensive paper or a card filled with hollow sentiments. Instead, I carried a professional leather briefcase containing 65 high-quality, coil-bound copies of a document titled Summary of Financial Irregularities, Vansworth Global and CVK Aesthetics. Each packet was the result of 100 hours of forensic accounting, a detailed roadmap of the $842,000 in illegal wire transfers, and the systematic tax evasion that had funded the very party I was now walking into. I could feel the weight of the paper against my hip, a physical manifestation of the truth that my father had tried to bury under layers of corporate shell companies and parental gaslighting. As I walked onto the lawn, the rhythmic crunch of my heels on the gravel seemed to silence the ambient hum of the string quartet playing in the background. I moved through the crowd of silk dresses and custom tuxedos, the scent of expensive perfume and blooming jasmine cloying in the night air, and I saw them. My mother, Evelyn, was draped in a new set of South Sea pearls, her face a mask of practiced serenity, as she laughed at a joke made by the wife of a local congressman. Chloe stood at the center of a small circle of admirers, wearing a shimmering gold gown that cost more than my first year of college tuition, her skin tanned from the Spanish sun and her expression one of utter, undisturbed triumph. She looked at me for a split second, her eyes widening with a flicker of annoyance that I would dare show up uninvited and underdressed for her aesthetic. But she quickly turned back to her glass of champagne, dismissed me as a footnote in her evening. My father, Harrison, stood near the makeshift stage where the microphone was set up for the evening's toasts, holding a heavy crystal tumbler filled with 18-year-old Macallan. He looked at me with a disdain so pure it was almost physical, a cold, jagged wall of contempt that he had used to keep me in my place for 29 years. He didn't see a daughter. He saw a liability that had finally shown up to collect a debt he had no intention of paying. He adjusted his silk tie and took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, his eyes never leaving mine as I approached the stage. He likely thought I was there to beg for a place back in the family, or perhaps to offer a tearful apology for my defiance on my wedding day. But he had underestimated the girl he had trained to find the cracks in every foundation. He had raised a risk auditor, and tonight I was here to provide the final assessment of his character. I walked straight to the microphone, the feedback a sharp, sudden chirp that cut through the laughter and the clinking of silverware like a razor. The 65 guests turned as one, their faces a sea of curiosity and confusion, wondering who this woman in the sharp black suit was and why she was interrupting the flow of the Moet and Chandon. I looked out at the front row, at the two people who had left mahogany chairs empty at my wedding, and I felt a profound, echoing stillness in my soul. I reached into my briefcase and began distributing the 65 copies of the audit summary to the guests nearest the stage, the heavy paper thudding as it passed from hand to hand. I watched as the chairman of the board of Vanceworth Global picked up a copy, his brow furrowing as his eyes caught the words "wire fraud and embezzlement" on the very first page. I watched as my mother's smile faltered, her hand going to her pearls as she realized the black suit I was wearing wasn't for a party, but for a funeral. "My name is Sarah Jane Vanceworth," I said into the microphone, my voice amplified and steady, echoing across the estate and through the open windows of the mansion where my childhood memories were stored like dusty trophies. For most of my life, I have been told that I was the secondary daughter, the one whose milestones were less important than a $14,000 vacation or a white Porsche Macan. I have been told that my marriage was a contract signing and that my worth was measured by my obedience to a family brand that I now know is built on a foundation of federal felonies. My father and my sister have spent the last 4 years treating Vanceworth Global like a personal ATM, funneled through a shell company called CVK Aesthetics to the tune of $842,000. I saw the movement in the crowd, the sharp intake of breath as the guests began to flip through the pages of evidence, the bank statements and the dash cam footage stills showing the illegal transfers in high definition. My father's face went from a deep, mottled red to a ghostly, translucent white, the glass of Macallan shaking in his hand until the ice cubes chimed against the crystal. He tried to speak, to roar me down with the authority he had used to silence me for decades, but the words died in his throat as he saw his own board of directors staring at the evidence of his betrayal. Chloe's golden gown seemed to lose its luster in the harsh light of the stage, her mouth falling open in a silent scream of realization that the life she had been gifted was about to be repossessed by the very sister she had mocked. I didn't stop. I detailed the 48 wire transfers, the tax IDs, and the way the minority shareholders, many of whom were standing in that very crowd, had been defrauded to pay for the Wagyu sliders they were currently chewing. I laid the audit bare, stripping away the luxury and the prestige until all that was left was the cold, hard math of their corruption. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that fell over the 65 guests as the gravity of the federal felonies settled in. I looked at my father one last time, not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a professional who had successfully completed a difficult assignment. He was no longer the imposing patriarch of a Connecticut dynasty. He was a man facing an SEC investigation and the total collapse of his social standing. I had spent 29 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was funded by theft, and in 10 minutes, I had flipped that table over and exposed the rot beneath the fine linens. I stepped down from the microphone, the click of my heels the only sound in the night air, and walked toward the driveway without looking back. I had no more words for them, no more calculations to run, and no more liabilities to manage. As I got into my Audi and drove away from the Vanceworth estate, the tail lights of the 65 cars parked along the driveway looked like glowing embers of a dying fire. I thought about Marcus, waiting for me at our fixer-upper with a bottle of $12 wine and a heart that was worth more than the $85,000 Porsche I had just effectively set on fire. I realized then that the final audit wasn't just about the money or the fraud. It was about the moment you decide that your integrity is worth more than the comfort of a lie. My parents and my sister had chosen their path in Ibiza and the Maldives, and I had chosen mine in the quiet rooms of forensic accounting and the arms of a man who actually saw me. The balance sheet of my life was finally, irreversibly clean. Family is not the name on the gate or the money in the trust. Family is the truth you are willing to stand by when the lights go out. I was Sarah Jane. I was a wife. I was a whistleblower. And as the gates of the estate vanished in my rearview mirror, I knew I was finally, beautifully, and permanently free of the debt of being a Vanceworth. The story of the golden child was over, and the audit of the discarded daughter had finally reached its conclusion. I had given them the only gift they deserved, the truth and the consequences that came with it. "Attention, everyone," I said, my voice modulated to exactly 75 decibels, a volume that was neither a scream nor a whisper, but possessed a clinical, terrifying resonance that sliced through the evening air like a surgical blade. I did not stand before the assembled elite of Greenwich to talk about the wedding they had skipped or the emotional neglect I had weathered for 29 years, because in the world of the Vanceworths, emotions were soft and easily dismissed. But a ledger that didn't balance was an unforgivable sin. The string quartet had faltered into a confused silence, and the only sound remaining was the gentle splash of the tiered fountain and the heavy, ragged breathing of my father, Harrison, who stood frozen with his 18-year-old McCallan trembling in his hand. I did not give them a chance to recover their social footing. Instead, I opened the first page of the summary of financial irregularities and began to read the cold, hard data of their betrayal, starting with the $842,000 that had been siphoned out of Vanceworth Global under the guise of consulting fees. I started reading the dates and the exact figures with the rhythmic, haunting precision of a ticking clock, watching as each number landed like a physical blow on the reputations of the people standing on that lawn. "October 12th, $18,500, I announced, my voice carrying to the very edge of the stone terrace where the catering staff stood frozen with their silver trays. "November 3rd, $22,000, I continued, tracking the flow of capital that had bypassed the legal safeguards of the company to land directly in the accounts of CVK Aesthetics, my sister's transparently fraudulent shell company. As I read, I signaled to my husband, Marcus, who moved through the crowd with a professional, quiet dignity, handing out the bound documents to the guests, many of whom were not just family friends but minority shareholders whose own investments had been diluted by my father's greed. I watched the color drain from my father's face, his skin turning a shade of gray that looked like ash in the moonlight, as he realized that the auditor he had raised had finally come home to collect on the ultimate liability. Chloe, standing at the center of the terrace in her shimmering gold gown, reached out for a plate of appetizers from a passing waiter, but her fingers were shaking so violently that the $12 porcelain dish slipped from her grasp. It hit the Italian marble floor with a sharp, crystalline explosion, the fine shards scattering across the stone and the expensive Wagyu sliders rolling into the shadows, a sound that felt like the first structural crack in the Vanceworth empire. The silence that followed the shatter was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum where the only thing that mattered was the objective truth printed on the pages now being held by the most powerful people in Connecticut. This silence was broken only by the sound of Aunt Diane gasping as she reached page 14 of the audit, her hand flying to her throat as she realized that her own quarterly dividends had been suppressed to pay for Chloe's $14,000 Ibiza retreat and her overwater bungalow in the Maldives. Diane had been one of the company's earliest investors, a woman who trusted my father with her inheritance, and the look of pure, unadulterated betrayal on her face was a more powerful indictment than any legal filing I had prepared with Marcus Thorne. I continued through the list, my voice never wavering as I detailed the systematic embezzlement that had turned a respectable logistics firm into a private slush fund for the golden child. I spoke about the December wire transfers that coincided exactly with the purchase of Chloe's white Porsche Macan, and the March disbursements that covered the $3,500 monthly rent on her Lincoln Park apartment while the company was officially reporting a period of austerity. Every person on that lawn was now looking at my father not as a titan of industry, but as a common thief who had stolen from his own blood and his own business partners to maintain a facade of perfection. The 65 guests were no longer sipping their Moet and Chandon. They were gripping the audit reports, their eyes darting between the spreadsheets and the man standing on the stage who looked like he had aged 20 years in the space of 5 minutes. My mother, Evelyn, tried to step forward, her hand reaching out as if she could still manage the optics of the situation. But she stopped when she saw the look in the eyes of the other women on the terrace, women who had been her friends for decades and were now realizing they had been lied to. The social capital she had spent a lifetime building was evaporating in the 72-degree night air, leaving her standing in her Loro Piana wrap like a ghost in a haunted house. I looked at her, and then I looked at Chloe, who was staring at the shattered porcelain at her feet as if it were the remains of her entire future, which in many ways it was. The white Porsche, the designer clothes, the luxury vacations, and the unearned status were all tied to the $842,000. And now that the source had been exposed as a crime, the assets would inevitably be frozen and seized. I turned my gaze back to my father, who finally met my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a man I needed to please or a father I needed to win over. I saw a defendant. "You called my wedding a contract signing, Dad," I said, the microphone picking up the cold, final edge in my tone as I closed the folder in my hands. And as an auditor, I've always been very clear on the terms of a contract. When there is a fundamental breach, the relationship is terminated, and the guilty party is held liable for the damages. You chose a beach club in Spain over your daughter's vows, and you chose to steal from your partners to fund a life for Chloe that she didn't earn. The audit is complete, and the findings have already been delivered to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the District Attorney's Office. This isn't a family conversation anymore. It's a matter of public record. The reaction was a slow-motion collapse of the evening's festivities, with several of the minority shareholders immediately pulling out their phones to call their own legal counsel, their hushed, urgent voices creating a low-frequency hum of impending litigation. The prestige of the Vansworth name, which had been the primary currency of my childhood, was now a toxic asset that everyone was trying to divest from as quickly as possible. My father dropped his glass, the heavy crystal thudding onto the grass, the 18-year-old Macallan soaking into the perfectly manicured lawn, a fitting end to a night that was supposed to be a triumph of his favored daughter. He looked at me, his mouth working but no sound coming out, stripped of the power and the arrogance that had been his only way of communicating with the world. I walked down the steps of the stage, my black Alexander McQueen suit a stark, dark silhouette against the gold and white of the party, and I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any I had ever known. I didn't feel the need to stay and watch the final destruction. I had provided the evidence. I had triggered the audit, and the law would handle the rest. I walked past Aunt Diane, who looked at me with a mixture of shock and a new, burgeoning respect, and I walked past Chloe, who was now crying, the tears ruining her expensive makeup as she realized the golden cage was finally open and there was nowhere for her to go. I moved toward the driveway where Marcus was waiting for me in the Audi, the engine already running, a smooth and reliable sound that represented the life I had built for myself, far away from the corruption of Greenwich. As we drove away from the estate, I looked back one last time at the lights of the mansion, which were now flickering as guests began to leave in a frantic, uncoordinated exodus, their headlights cutting through the navy blue night like searchlights. The Welcome Back Gala had become a farewell to the Vansworth legacy, a final closing of the books on a family that had valued appearances over integrity and favoritism over fairness. I thought about the $842,000 and the empty chairs at my wedding, and I realized that the numbers finally made sense. The cost of my freedom had been high, involving the forfeit of my family and the destruction of my father's career, but the return on investment was a life of absolute truth. I was Sarah Jane, I was an auditor, and I had finally balanced the only account that truly mattered. The drive back to New Haven was quiet, the cool air coming through the vents and the soft glow of the dashboard providing a sanctuary of reality after the theatrical fraud of the evening. I reached over and took Marcus's hand, feeling the solid, honest weight of it. And I knew that whatever happened next, the depositions, the court cases, the inevitable media scrutiny, we would face it as a team. My name was no longer a liability, and my past was no longer a debt I had to repay with my silence. I had audited the Vansworth family, and I had found them fundamentally insolvent. As the miles clicked by on the digital odometer, I felt the weight of 29 years of second-place finishes and overlooked achievements finally lift from my shoulders. I was the one who had stayed behind to do the math, and in the end, the math was the only thing that had saved me. The silence of the night was no longer a burden. It was the sound of a clean slate, a fresh ledger, and a future that I had earned with every single meticulously documented page. I was done being the daughter they ignored. I was the auditor who had brought them to their knees, and I had never felt more alive. By 8 a.m. the following morning, the gilded world of Vansworth Global did not wake up to its usual rhythm of high-stakes logistics and international commerce, but instead to the cold, mechanical sound of an emergency board of directors meeting. The news of the summary of financial irregularities had moved through the corporate ranks with the speed of a contagion, and by the time the sun had fully risen over the Stamford skyline, the decision was unanimous and irreversible. My father, Harrison Vansworth, a man who had spent 3 decades cultivating an image of untouchable executive power, was formally ousted as CEO, stripped of his voting rights, and escorted from the building by the very security team whose salaries he had been paying with compromised funds. He was no longer the patriarch of a shipping empire. He was a liability that the board was desperate to liquidate before the federal regulators arrived to dismantle the entire structure. He is currently facing a comprehensive IRS audit that, according to the preliminary reports from Marcus Thorne's office, will cost him upwards of $1.2 million in back taxes, interest, and civil penalties, a figure that does not even account for the potential criminal charges looming on the horizon for wire fraud and embezzlement. The collapse of the Vansworth facade was as swift as it was absolute, a domino effect that spared no one who had profited from the $842,000 in stolen dividends. Chloe's white Porsche Macan, the vehicle that had served as the mobile throne for the family's golden child, was repossessed 3 days ago at exactly 11:15 a.m. while she was sitting in a boutique coffee shop in Greenwich, trying to explain to her followers why her latest luxury retreat had been abruptly canceled. I am told the scene was public and humiliating, with the flatbed truck pulling the garnet-red leather-clad SUV away while she stood on the sidewalk clutching an $18 avocado toast. But I didn't see it myself. I wasn't there to witness her downfall because I was already 1,000 miles away, physically and emotionally detached from the wreckage of a life I had finally stopped trying to salvage. I sat in my new office, a space filled with the scent of fresh rain and the clean cedarwood aroma of high-end Pacific Northwest architecture, and picked up my titanium gray $1,400 iPhone 15 Pro Max. With a series of steady, deliberate movements, I navigated to the contact list that had dictated my anxiety for 29 years and began the process of digital excision. I blocked my father's number, my mother's number, and Chloe's number, ensuring that their frantic excuses, their venomous threats, and their hollow pleas for financial assistance would never again vibrate against my palm. I wasn't interested in their version of the truth or their attempts to audit my conscience for a sense of guilt I didn't possess. I had delivered the evidence, I had balanced the ledger, and I had fulfilled my obligation to the truth. The rest was merely the inevitable consequence of their own insolvency. Marcus and I have moved to a new home in the hills above Seattle, a modern architectural masterpiece of glass and steel that looks out over the gray, churning waters of the Puget Sound and the distant, snow-capped peaks of the Olympic Mountains. It is a house protected by a 15-foot matte black security gate that operates with a silent, hydraulic precision, a physical barrier that mirrors the emotional boundaries I have finally learned to construct. There is no crushed gravel driveway here, no mahogany-paneled studies filled with stolen wealth, and no front row of empty chairs. Our new kitchen features minimalist white oak cabinetry and a sub-zero refrigerator stocked with groceries we paid for with our own salaries. A simple reality that feels more luxurious than anything I ever experienced in Greenwich. The air here is thin and cold, smelling of salt and pine, and it feels like the first time I have been able to breathe without the suffocating weight of the Vansworth expectations pressing down on my chest. The peace I have found in this new life is something that $842,000 of lies could never have bought. A tranquility that stems from the knowledge that I am no longer a footnote in someone else's fraudulent narrative. I spent nearly 3 decades playing a game where the rules were rigged against me, trying to earn the love of people who viewed me as an auditor to be managed rather than a daughter to be cherished. I allowed them to make me feel small, to make me feel like a liability, while all along, I was the only one with the integrity to see the world for what it actually was. The $1.2 million in penalties my father now owes the government is a fitting price for the years of silence he demanded from me, and the repossession of Chloe's Porsche is a small down payment on the debt of character she has accumulated since childhood. Every evening, Marcus and I sit on our balcony as the sun sets behind the mountains, the sky turning a bruised purple and orange that reflects off the water below. We don't talk about the litigation or the board meetings or the federal subpoenas that are currently being served in Connecticut. We talk about his new residency program at the University of Washington, my new role as a director of internal audit for a global tech firm, and the garden we are planning to plant in the spring. We talk about a future that is defined by what we build together, not by what was taken from others. The silence here isn't the heavy, accusatory silence of my parents' house. It is the quiet of a life that is finally, beautifully in balance. I am Sarah Jane, and I am no longer a risk to be mitigated or a secondary asset to be ignored. I am the architect of my own security, the auditor of my own soul, and for the first time in 29 years, I have everything I need. Looking back at the empty chairs in that stone chapel in Connecticut, I realized that they weren't a sign of my failure, but a sign of my graduation. They were the last things I had to lose before I could finally be found. I had to let the Vansworth empire burn so that I could walk out of the smoke with my dignity intact, a trade that I would make 1,000 times over if given the chance, My father's logistics company will likely be sold off in pieces. My sister will have to learn what it means to earn a living, and my mother will have to face the social vacuum left by their disgrace. But none of that is my concern anymore. I have closed the books on that chapter of my life, archived the files, and moved on to a new ledger where the only currency is respect, and the only interest is the love of the people who actually show up. Family isn't something that is guaranteed by blood, and it isn't something that can be maintained through embezzlement and exclusion. It is a choice we make every day to be honest, to be present, and to value the people beside us more than the image we project to the world. I am 29 years old, and I have learned that the most important risk to audit is the one you take on your own heart. I took that risk on my wedding night, sitting in the blue light of a MacBook Pro, and it resulted in the greatest payout of my life, a sense of self that can never be seized by the IRS or repossessed by a bank. I am free, I am happy, and I am finally, undeniably, home. The story of the Vanceworths is a cautionary tale of what happens when greed becomes the family business. But my story is a testament to the power of a single, honest voice in a room full of expensive lies. I have the peace that only the truth can provide. And as the gates click shut behind me, I know that the final audit is finally, perfectly complete.